Welcome to Dig Deep, the mining podcast. In this podcast, we go deep into mining news, hot topics, and live interviews with mining professionals and leading figures in the mining industry. Introducing your host, Rob Tyson, founder and director of Mining International and Mining International Executive, a leading global mining recruitment and headhunting agency.
Hi, mining community. Welcome back to another episode of the Dig Deep, the mining podcast, the show that brings you the latest insights, thought leadership and stories from across the global mining industry. Today, we're talking about a topic that doesn't get nearly enough airtime, gender-based violence, or GBV. And what it means to mining's culture, safety and future. Joining me are three people who have helped bring this issue into a sharper focus recently, and their recent collaboration on the Intelligent Miner opened up a powerful and at times uncomfortable conversation about how mining can and must do better. We're joined by Leonida, who's the founder and editor of the Intelligent Miner. Abbi Buxton, an independent consultant who partners with organisations across the resources sector, including mining companies, to tackle GBV and advance equality in workplaces and communities. And Mahmood Sonday, who is the managing director of Reos Partners, a global advisory firm that helps organisations address systematic challenges. He's worked with numerous mining companies to develop and implement strategies to successfully tackle GBV and harassment. So let's get straight into this and welcome Carly, Abbi and Mahmood. How are you guys doing?
Good. Thank you for having us.
Thanks, Rob. Thanks for having us.
Great.
Doing well. Thanks, Rob. Thanks for having us. Yeah.
No worries. Great. So as we always start these podcasts off, I just wondered if we can each individually just tell us a little bit about ourselves, a little bit about our careers, and anything else. So let's start with Carly.
I'll go first. So I'm Carly. I'm a technical writer and editor. I've been working in the mining sector for close to 20 years now. Managed and written for lots of the big trade titles in the industry, such as Mining Magazine, Engineering and Mining Journal. I set up the Intelligent Miner in 2019 because I felt that there was room in the sector for a publication that could make mining interesting and engaging for companies and collaborators across the value chain. And I won't lie, it's a really fun publication to write. I love getting to delve into the sorts of topics that don't appear in the majority of publications. So that's me.
Great. And Abbi?
Hi, Rob. Thanks. So similar to Carly, I've worked in the sector for 20 years, but also grew up in mining communities in Southern Africa. So I've been 4 decades in the mining sector. Work-wise, primarily in independent research, so looking at the social impacts of and sustainability impacts of mining and communities in particular, and then spent a couple of years at Behaviours, where I worked at group social performance, but also led and designed their gender-based violence program. So now work independently, pulling all that together and working with companies, but also governments and policymakers and civil society and research to kind of start pushing forward this agenda a little bit more and understand what we need to tackle it.
Mahmood.
Thanks, Rob. So, yes, I'm the managing director of Reos Partners. We're a social impact company that works on systemic challenges, often across a whole range of developmental issues with leading institutions, private sector, governments, as well as international civil society. And my background is actually in the private sector, but I've also worked in government, in philanthropy, and for the last few years focused quite extensively on GBV. The work we've done in Reos is focused on GBV for over a decade in Australia, Brazil, and more recently in South Africa.
Great. So I suppose the first question is, before we get into more of a conversation, how did all this come about? And I suppose what prompted you to start writing and talking publicly about GBV in the mining industry? And why do you think the timing is right for this conversation to happen sort of now in today's environment?
I guess I'll start with that one. So the Intelligent Miner article that we're talking about, we ran in June 2025, so earlier this year, and it was really 6 months in the making. So in late 2024, there was class action brought against 2 major mining companies in relation to sexual harassment in the workplace in Australia. And there were a lot of knee-jerk reactions to this topic in the media, across social media. And I got together with Beth Barodi and Peggy Bell from the Femina Collective in January 2025, just to talk about A, how we were feeling about the topic, and B, what we could actually do to help move the conversation forward. And in my case, I'm a writer. That's what I do. That's my gift. I go away, I find experts who can offer really helpful, valuable insights on these topics, and then put them together into something that's thought-provoking and interesting and can provide a starting point for sort of further conversations and actions. So following that conversation with Peggy and Beth, I went away and sought out some leaders who I know have got deep experience, deep insights into some of these topics. And one of those people was Kevin D'Souza from KD Consulting. And he said, you need to talk to Abbi Buxton. She's a world expert on this topic. I know she'll have lots to offer here. Had a great chat with Abbi, who introduced me to Mahmood, because they've been working together on some programs for mining companies. And so I kind of went on this learning journey over 5 or 6 months where I spoke to different experts. I started to distill those insights, and it culminated in the article that we ran in June 2025. And I think it's worth saying as well that the Intelligent Miner actually wasn't our first choice of platform to publish this on. I actually went out about a month prior to this and pitched the article to lots of general media outlets and to sort of broader business publications, lots of very well-known names who, for whatever reason, weren't interested. But I really think they should be. I mean, we all know that mining is an absolutely essential foundational industry. It provides, the metals and minerals that we use to generate and convey power. It provides the fertilizers that we need to grow crops and feed the global population. It provides the materials that we need to build cities. And it's also an industry at the moment that's suffering really hard from a talent shortage, which you will well know, Rob, as someone who works in recruitment and leadership development. And a lot of that is down to the way in which the industry is perceived by the general public, but also people's lived experiences within the sector. And I think, particularly for women, gender-based violence plays a big part in that. And I think it's also worth defining what gender-based violence is. Sexual harassment is just one type of gender-based violence. And Abbi gave a really brilliant sort of succinct summary in the article that we wrote, actually. So violence is any behavior that's used against others with the intent of causing harm, whether that's physical, psychological, emotional, financial, whatever. If it's harm, it's a type of violence. And so when we think about gender-based violence, our minds automatically go to things like sexual assault. But obviously there's a lot more to it than that. So it could involve innuendo, it could involve threats, it could involve tech facilitated harm, so sharing of photos, things like that. There's a lot more to it than you would initially think. And often gender-based violence occurs systemically in the workplace in tandem with other types of discrimination. So things like racism, ableism, ageism. And so I think it's really important that we tackle this. And also from a long-term perspective, there are financial and economic impacts of gender-based violence. So another statistic that we gave in the article was that the impacts of violence against women and girls amounts to something like 2% of global GDP every year, which is quite staggering when you think about it. So I think it's really important that the industry pays more attention to this topic and makes it an everyday part of conversations around safety, around culture, things like that. But obviously, while this topic is fairly new to the Intelligent Miner, it's the first time we've covered it, and it's a journey that I've been on over the past 6 months learning about it. Mahmood and Abbi have been working on this for a long time, and this is something they're on the front line every day with mining companies, helping them to develop programs and systems that can tackle this. So they'll have insights to offer here too.
Yeah, and Abby, I wondered if you can follow on from that, and I suppose what were your thoughts when Carly first approached you?
Yeah, no, it was great to talk to Carly, and it was interesting because it came at an interesting time, I think. And I'll let Mahmood expand a bit more on that, because we're living in a sort of quite complex socio-political and geopolitical time, right? That's influencing how we're talking about this. But I've been working independently in this space for about a year, and it's quite interesting to see how people aren't still quite willing to talk about it, how there is whilst the time is now in many ways, there is still this pushback. And this kind of falls more broadly within a pushback against ESG, against EDI, and trying to figure out, okay, why GBV? And I guess the point I want to make in this, and whilst there has been a pushback, human rights are not going anywhere. And the mining sector has quite a complex relationship, if we want to say that, with human rights. It's so critical to how the industry does business, whether it's community or workplaces. We hold human rights very, very highly. But like anywhere in the world, we make mistakes on a daily basis. Gender-based violence is a human rights violation. And I think often we forget that. And there was this great speech I went to once by the Lesotho UN High Coordinator, and she said, we look at these wars that are happening all over the world, but we forget the wars that are being waged on women's bodies every single day, in our homes, in our streets, in our communities, and in our workplaces. And I think, when you take it down to that level, and that's not something we want to stand for. And you speak to any leader in the mining sector in those terms, and they don't want to stand for that. But also society is responding to that. And, the mining sector has a very, close relationship with societal demand, societal expectation, whether it's sort of global or local community level. And we really need to sort of understand, okay, there is this groundswell of wanting to do something about GBV, looking at violence against women and girls. How is the sector going to respond to that? Because as Carly says, it's an unprecedented skill shortage, according to McKinsey, right? And that is women and young people who don't want to work in a sector that, is known for its violence and its harm, right? Because especially there is the legal environment now where, BHP Billiton and Rio Tinto are facing class actions against GBV on the grounds of GBV. So there are shifts taking place. The regulatory environment is changing. There's been some really interesting changes in the UK and in South Africa, which is saying, okay, what are we doing on GBV prevention? There is a step up, and that South African legislation is actually mining sector specific. So there are these drivers, but at the same time, there is a reluctance in the sector still to push forward. And we need to sort of work with that and say, yes, the time is now, but how do we kind of feel into this reluctance, and what do we do in order to effect change meaningfully with that context?
And Mahmood, do you like to add anything else?
Yes, I think the point you've just made, Abby, really about human rights and violence reminds me of the context within which this issue has really taken off in the last few years and how that context has evolved. So GBV and violence against women is an issue that's been with us for a very long time. We've been working on it for more than 10 years. But what happened in 2022 is the release of the Rio Tinto report. And they made this bold decision to publicly release the findings that were the result of an independent evaluation. And I think many mining companies sort of privately acknowledge that they could easily have put their own company name on that report, because the findings were really a reflection of what was happening in the industry. And the broader context, we were just sort of still in the wake of the Me Too moment and the Black Lives Matter moment. And so it became clear that there was this gap between company cultures and sort of the evolving societal expectations. But what's happened since then is we've seen a regression. If we talk about broadly the kind of political and cultural climate, I'd say that, you know, we're seeing sort of an ascendancy of a political culture which is increasingly authoritarian. If you look at the attacks on DEI, I mean, the whole notion of DEI has become almost radioactive now. Disregard for laws, rights and norms, um, you know, a descent into sort of a form of indecency, which is not just localized in workplaces, but I think your point, Abby, about laws, even if you think about human rights and the disregard for uh, international human rights law, and we think about the conflicts that are currently ongoing, including in the war in Gaza, where mining companies have just recently been implicated by the UN special rapporteur's report. So we can't disconnect what's happening in the broader culture, what's happening within society from what happens uh, often against women, with women in workplaces and in homes. We're in a culture which has normalized violence, and the mining sector is a big part of that story. Yeah.
Mining has made a huge, obviously, progress on physical safety. But when we talk about gender-based violence or harassment, many people still see it as an HR problem rather than a safety one. How do you see GBV connecting to the broader concept of safety, physical and psychology and culture in mining? And I suppose I'll ask Carly's first impression on that.
Yeah, so I think the mining industry has made huge strides over the past 30 to 40 years when it comes to physical safety. We can look at the stats from organizations like the ICMM. In North America, people like MSHA and NIOSH, and you can see that there has been a gradual and sustained decline in safety incidents across the industry. But I think over the past 5 years, there's been an acknowledgement that's not enough. We need to expand this concept of safety to include things like cultural safety, psychological safety, emotional safety, even cyber safety and online safety. Because at the end of the day, it's not enough to be safe. People need to feel safe if they're going to give their best at work. And so even if we look at things like Deloitte's Tracking the Trends report, EY's 10 risks and opportunities over the past couple of years, those have included acknowledgement that we need to have a sort of evolution in the way that we view safety. And also, if we look at coverage in mining media, this is something that I always look at as a journalist, but I've seen a lot of articles over the past few years on safety as a broader concept, and also at events too. But I think the point here is that we need to not just look at GBV in the context of safety. There's a lot more to it than that. And I know that this is something Mahmood and Abbi feel very strongly about.
Mahmood, your thoughts?
Yes, I think the point about framing GBV within the broader safety lens has definite pros, and there are some drawbacks or nuances that I think we need to be aware of. So some of the obvious advantages are there's this massive focus and clear business case and powerful infrastructure, systems and structures around safety, including leadership focus on safety, which definitely can be leveraged to advance the focus on gender-based violence and this question of psychological safety. So to make the connection first between psychological safety and physical safety is the first key thing, to recognize that those two things are deeply connected. And so seeing psychological safety as a prerequisite and in some ways a non-negotiable is going to be key to driving change. But the drawback, and I think this is where the nuance is needed, I've often seen psychological safety, the notion of psychological safety actually being misunderstood. Misunderstood to mean that people would be working in an environment where everyone feels safe from discomfort, when in fact, the key idea behind psychological safety is about creating an environment where people feel comfortable enough or psychologically safe enough to speak up, to speak out, you know. And so that key distinction is really important. There's a crucial difference, especially when you recognize that speaking up or speaking out can often lead people to feel uncomfortable, you know, or unsettled. And so what it requires is really building a culture and a capacity to be able to sit with the discomfort that often arises when people make their voices heard. And so where this leads us to is the question of culture and leadership, you know, being able to build a culture where people can talk about difficult things, sit with the discomfort, but also recognize that in connecting psychological safety with a broader question of safety, that things like zero tolerance, you know, if it shuts down conversation or if it leads people to suppress what they're really feeling or experiencing, it can be counterintuitively actually something that holds back or constrains progress on gender-based violence.
And Abby?
Yeah, no, just to pick up on some of these points. I think Carly also, she said, what does it mean to feel safe? And this sort of builds on, actually, how do I feel safe as a woman versus man? Like, what does safety look and feel like to me versus what it feels like to a man? And also, what would that feel if I was white versus black? What does it feel compared to my role and rank within the organization? How does actually safety look and feel different for different people? I think, the mining sector has made huge progress on safety, but arguably from a perspective of a sort of male-led industry. We've seen huge advancements in PPE, for example, over the last couple of years, trying to understand, okay, what do women need to feel safe on a physical level? But actually, if we begin to understand and ask women, well, how do you feel safe? I remember having a conversation with someone where a man who was quite surprised when we said, well, as a woman, I wouldn't feel safe waiting at the bus stop at night. And he kind of went, what? And it's like, yeah, it's little things like that. How do I as a woman feel about certain things? And therefore, how does that shift the sort of questions we need to be asking within safety audits, for example, the sort of analysis we need to be doing, the questions we need to be asking, etc. So that's one point. The other one I would share is one of the things at De Beers, when we all got together and spoke about DBV and how we would bring it in, one of the concerns of the general managers is that it would just be another project and just another thing that the business would throw itself into, and then it would be forgotten. And of course, we know that with DBV, we are going to need long-term sustained change, but also the general managers really felt that they didn't want it to just be something that came and went. And I think safety really gives us that opportunity to kind of build it into the core, the systems, the culture, and sort of bring it into, the way that the business is run. And, if we think about, okay, what would it look like if we made GBV a lost time injury, which it actually is. If you look at the statistics, actually, the biggest cost to businesses of GBV is not in the legal costs. It's in productivity losses. It's in talent retention, recruitment, etc. That's where the impact's had. I think in the research shows in Australia that you're looking at 2.6 billion a year in losses for GBV and productivity. And Peru, the numbers are 6.7 billion. And 70% of those costs are borne by companies. So this is a lost time injury, right? This is having an impact on operations. So if the sector needs to think about it in that way, if they need to kind of bring it in that way so it becomes part of everyday operations, let's do that. Let's make it part of the system. And then gradually we can start to shift the culture just by doing things differently on a day-to-day basis.
If we accept that GBV is a safety issue and obviously not just a behavioural one, what should companies be actually doing? And what practical steps can leaders take to make sure prevention and response are built into obviously their existing safety systems rather than just a bolted on after that obviously effect and something happens?
Thanks, Rob. No, this is quite an interesting one, and it's, as I say, as a GBV and an independent consultant, a lot of approaches that I get, the first instance, companies want either a policy or a grievance mechanism. And there's kind of a career limiting response that I have is either, well, actually, I can design you the best grievance mechanism in the world. And the thing is if you haven't properly thought about what issue it is that you're facing and grounded it within your organization, it's going to fall flat. And that's the same with the policy. You could go into AI and get them to design a GBV policy for you today. You don't need to pay me to do that. What we need to think about actually is how is GBV manifesting in your organization? How is it showing up for you within your organizational culture, but also within the community that you operate in? Within GBV, we talk about the GBV pyramid of harm, which is, following on from what Carly said earlier, we often think about sort of rape as sort of and femicide. But really, that's just at the top of the pyramid. And those instances, whilst, significant, are actually only happening a minority of times. What we have at the base of the pyramid is the organizational culture, the societal culture, the harmful gender norms, the stereotypes, etc., that are perpetrating. Then you move up the pyramid and gradually you see those minor acts of harms, the sexual innuendos, the comments, the inappropriate touching, but even actually standing a bit too close to me, that sort of, talking over women in meetings, etc. And then gradually you move up and up the pyramid where, people are starting to, experience more significant acts of verbal abuse, sexual assault, etc. So if you really want to tackle GBV, you need to understand what the base of your pyramid looks like as well as the top of the pyramid. So, we often speak about, you hear, a general manager or a CEO want to know, how many incidents have we got? What's my number of GBV incidents? And there's a huge reliance on that sort of quantitative formalized data that is coming through your grievance mechanisms, people who are actually reporting GBV. But actually a lot of GBV doesn't get reported. So those systems are inherently unreliable. What you really need to be tapping into is sort of this broader understanding of what is the culture, what is the informal data points, what is it people are talking about, how is it people feel, what is the culture, what are the comments, because if you, as I say, you could have your grievance mechanism in place, but around the water cooler, people are saying, yeah, but do you remember what happened to so-and-so, and then they lost their job. Or, that's just going to stop at this point and no one's going to do anything about it. You're the one who's going to get harmed. That sort of thing is just going to shut everyone down. And then your culture and the risk of GBV is going to be increased because you've lost transparency. You've lost that openness to speak out, which Mahmood was referring to. So actually, the first thing that companies need to do is understand what the context that you're dealing with. What are the structural inequalities? What are the harmful gender norms? What does that look like? How is GBV manifesting? What is the type of GBV that we're dealing with? What are those minor incidents and how are they leading to further harms? And you do that research, both in sort of your typical research ways, your human right impact assessments, your social impact assessments, your safety audits, etc. But you also do that research by listening to your organization. And I would really highlight here bringing in an expert to be survivor-centered and trauma-informed is really critical in any GBV work. But by listening to an organization, by engaging them in that conversation, by creating safe spaces for those dialogues to occur, you're also beginning to shift the culture. You're listening, you're learning, you're shaping the systems, you're understanding what's needed, but you're bringing people on the journey with you and you're helping them to understand what it is the organization's doing, and it becomes a dialogue. So that's really sort of the critical way for me that would be your first step, is how do we do the data collection? How do we do the knowledge, the gathering, the understanding, the listening, before then we begin to build the systems and policies that are responsive to that.
Mahmood, did you want to say something?
I'd like to build on that, particularly the point that Abbi made, which I think points to the need to really look at mining culture more fundamentally. And actually, when we think about the strength of mining culture, something that I think many people in the industry are proud of, it does also carry some inherent barriers that prevent progress on an issue like this. So when we think about changing culture, it's inherently difficult. It requires massive leadership commitment. And so the question becomes, how do you do that? How do you do that in a sector that is already under pressure from so many different perspectives, which is going through lots of changes. There's all sorts of disruption if we just think about what's happened this year alone in terms of tariffs. So part of what I would say is there's a need to think about this challenge a bit more systemically. In fact, to think beyond mining companies, to think about the system or the sector as a whole. And so taking a systems approach, I think, requires looking at how to create the conditions that can actually drive culture change in mining companies. And here, practically, I would say thinking about going upstream and downstream to drive prioritization and accountability. And upstream, I think investors, pension funds, pension fund advisors have an important role to play in um, really being able to ask the right questions and increase the level of attention to strengthen accountability at the executive and the board level. But then also downstream, if you look at large user groups or socially conscious consumers, the automotive industry, the electronics industry, and so forth, they have a role to play to really um, advocate, campaign, and put this issue on the agenda of mining companies to create the conditions to support executives to put this higher on the corporate agenda and really drive the kind of culture change that's required. So I think that's at the systems level. But then within companies, there's two quotes that sort of came to mind for me about this. The one is they're related. The one is the road to hell is paved with good intentions and bad incentives. And I think this talks to the point about accountability and incentives, which I think could include connecting executive compensation with workplace culture and specifically psychological safety. And I think seeing that connection and helping people see that this is business critical, this actually impacts the health of the company, the health of the share price, and the health of my bottom line as an executive can drive the kind of accountability which I think is lacking. And then linked to that is another quote which I think builds on what Abby shared, is the path to truth is paved with dialogue and disagreement. And so the thing here is that as Rios in particular, we really advocate for building a culture where people are able to openly disagree and respectfully hear each other, listen to people's stories, and really connect with the history of victimization and perpetration in the industry, which is not just about the relationship between genders, but actually has a deeper history if we think about dispossession, treatment of indigenous communities, the way power has been wielded. You see that the roots of violence goes quite deep in the mining sector. And yes, lots of progress has been made, but there's a need for a deeper examination of the culture of violence that unfortunately has become normalized in the sector.
Can I add to that, if that's okay? Just sort of listening and reflecting back. This is a systemic issue and it's going to require systemic coordinated action to address it. And we've seen in the mining sector what's possible when we do bring that together. If we look at things like the Global Tailings Review from a couple of years ago and what's come out the back of that, if companies band together and are willing to share data, if they're willing to talk about and listen to potential solutions, the impact that we can have is far greater. And this is another area where we could have that if wanted. It's there's something that everyone can do here at every company to make a difference.
Mining has a strong culture and sometimes that can make change difficult. What do you see as the biggest barriers or cultural norms that stop people speaking up or that allow harmful behaviours to continue?
I'm happy to jump in here and just build on some of the things that I shared just now around incentives and creating a culture where people are able to disagree and talk about difficult things. But I think in addition to that, and the points about elevating GBV to a strategic priority by bringing other actors into the equation, whether it's investors or user groups, consumers, and raising the profile of the issue to the level of an enterprise risk. And then there's lots of programming, best practice, and good lessons about what works to prevent and address GBV. But what I would say, practically, particularly in the mining industry, which remains as a male-dominated industry, it's going to be important to work with men, particularly to have conversations about masculinity, how notions of masculinity are evolving, and to talk about how to work with one's feelings individually and with others, including men confronting and engaging openly about problematic gender norms and how these sort of realities do contribute to these cycles of violence that disproportionately affect women, you know, and it plays out in the workplace, but it also plays out in communities and in homes. And I think the thing related to this, which makes it really difficult, and again underlines the need for a dialogic approach is because the question of gender, it's often so personal, and it connects to our identity, but also our religious beliefs and cultural norms, and it's also so polarizing in our current political climate. So how do we have a more nuanced conversation about gender and about our roles and about what's changing? Um, and I can speak from my own experience, having worked on this issue, but also related issues on race. On the one hand, you have women or even people of color, for that matter, you know, assuming positions of leadership, and that being assumed to be something that will change the situation. But often, on the other hand, it's also comes with a lots of stigma, and it's viewed to be sort of a DEI trope, that people are in positions because of their gender or because of their race. But on the other hand, just having people occupy those positions doesn't in and of itself guarantee that things will change. And there was an interesting commentary just this week about Japan's first female prime minister, and that was just a recent development, and people sort of commenting on whether that by itself is going to result in changes in gender equity. And I think there's some skepticism about that, So, yes, mining remains sort of male dominated, but I think instead of just denouncing that, we need to create space for a conversation where we can appreciate more about what is generative or positive about the masculine and the feminine, and to recognize that both of these drives, both of these things are really complementary. They're both important, and they actually exist in men and women, you know. And so creating a space where we can create an environment that is more mutually affirming through dialogue, I think can help to shift the culture more fundamentally.
I think that's a really good point, Mahmood. And just to add that often when we think about gender-based violence or talk about it, it's assumed to be a women's problem. And it's not. It's an us problem. It takes two at the end of the day. And addressing this issue will mean that workplaces are better for everybody, regardless of their gender, regardless of how they identify. Tackling this will make work better for everyone, full stop.
Yeah, 100%. And to follow up on some of the points that Mahmood made too, I mean, the laws that I mentioned in South Africa that have changed, that are actually now part of the Mine Health and Safety Act, actually have as one of the points of accountability, how many male forums have you held this year? So that the South African government, the Ministry for Mines has actually recognized that actually bringing men together to have those dialogues is a significant contributor to those changes, and they've made that regulation. And the other thing, I think the World Resources Institute did a fantastic piece of research a couple of years ago looking at gender and extractive governance. and found that, that over-reliance on quotas for female representation is just not enough, and because it doesn't necessarily translate into that systemic change. Actually just having women in those positions, it's great for representation. It's a great role modeling. It's not to undermine the importance of that. But how do we sort of actually, it's a systemic change that's needed. And the other point I'd make actually is, the mining sector, the violence against women and girls is a global problem, right? And the mining sector might feel, whoa, this isn't our issue. This is a global issue. We're moving into societies and communities. That's not necessarily of our making. 100%. However, there are certain structural realities within the sector that does increase the likelihood of gender-based violence, that does increase vulnerabilities. And that is around things like underground mining, large contractor workforces, the migrant labor, often male-dominated, remote locations where you don't have that oversight of rule of law, where you don't have the GBV service provision that you perhaps need, support services, etc. Vulnerable local communities, and we know within critical minerals mining that we're moving further into more remote communities, indigenous communities who face unique vulnerabilities. So there are increased risks, there are increased likelihood within the mining sector. But actually, I see that as quite empowering, because it's kind of a problem of our own making, therefore we can fix it. If there are things that are structural issues within the way that we operate, what are the changes then that we can make as a mining sector to actually tackle these issues? How can we look at shift working, flexible working, the way in which men and women engage in the sector, the introduction of higher levels of technology? What role is that actually going to have for women? If we increased automation, do we see more women in the sector? What role can they play in that? That's not my sector, the sort of EDI space, but, it's really interesting to think about actually what changes can we make as a sector, which actually would fundamentally shift these liabilities and actually make it a point of competitive advantage, actually. We're a sector who leads on this, who can make changes and actually can make a difference to the society rather than feeling like we're carrying society's burden.
You all made the point that no single company can tackle a GBV alone, and that this is really a systematic industry-wide issue tied to gender and radical justice more broadly. Why is collaboration across the sector so essential here, and what does meaningful joined-up action look like in practice?
Yeah, thanks, Rob. I'm happy to come in here because the work we do in Reos is strongly focused on this question of multi-stakeholder collaboration, which could be, in the case of GBV, collaboration amongst mining companies, collaboration in the sector, but also critically collaboration across sectors. And so specifically looking at how the mining sector or mining companies are working with government, are working with communities, are working with civil society in particular, and when we've been asked to support mining companies, often the request is quite explicit to say, well, look, we know that there's a relationship between what's happening at home and what's happening within the mining company. Let's just talk about the case that Abbi mentioned about the rise of contract mining. So contractors, we've learned, often are not treated the same way as permanent employees. When it comes to them getting into the mine, there's permitting challenges. We've seen people wait for hours, sometimes the whole day, in an unshaded part of the permitting office to get a permit. These people are hungry often, they're frustrated. And this is a practical example of how what happens in the mining company can potentially lead to particular behaviors at home, where people go home frustrated, exhausted, or feeling very vulnerable about their livelihoods. And that then spirals into conflict and into abuse. It's not hard to imagine how these things that we might think are administrative or bureaucratic can lead to incidents of violence in the home or at work. And so it's important to think about how to connect what's happening within the mining company with the kinds of programs that civil society organizations, NGOs are running, and to fund and support those programs, but also critically to think about how to connect with the infrastructure and the scale that government has to offer. Abby mentioned some of the policies and regulations that are becoming more commonplace now in South Africa across the private sector, but there's been some regulation that's mining sector specific. And so I think the risk, of course, is that you kind of move into a tick box mentality and just a compliance mindset. But I think there is a real opportunity for mining companies to work together with the private sector and civil society, but it requires quite specialized capacities to think about how do you really bring people together to have the right kinds of conversations. Some of these conversations can actually become quite harmful and can lead to finger pointing or spiral onto out of control and even lead to re-traumatization. Yeah. So the capacity to actually convene strategically, run the kinds of programs that can lead to innovation, that can build trust, that can really drive the direction of the issue in the right direction, but also not just about gender and gender-based violence. Often there's a need to think about other forms of discrimination that coalesce: racism, ableism, other forms of discrimination, even forms of religious discrimination, and to take a holistic or intersectional approach, which I think multi-stakeholder partnerships and collaborations enable by definition. We broaden the lens and think about what are the systemic roots of the issue and how do we tackle it in a more innovative way with partners sustainably.
Yeah, I think the other point worth mentioning, just to bring in one of the most powerful pieces of research actually on this topic was by Fidelity Investment, and you'll be able to find it if you search it. And they termed what they called culture-based financial risk. And they listed sexual harassment as a culture-based financial risk. And they explained how, from an investor's perspective, that has an impact on company productivity, revenue, expenditure, etc., which we've spoken about already. But actually, critically, one of the main points that they made is it has a sector-wide impact. And those sector-wide impacts are on access to finance and human capital. And I don't think anybody is looking to Rio, for example, and thinking you're the only issue here. I think all companies should be looking at themselves and going, okay, what Rio's done here has given us a lot of transparency and a lot of information. And likely chances are that's happening in my organization. So how do I start with actually the understanding that this is an issue? We will have GBV in our workforces, in our communities. And how do we move from that point? It's not about whether we have it, it's what it looks like and what is the scale. And so the other thing to mention is Mahmood and I are actually hosting a 2-hour workshop at the Mining Indaba this year. Where we'll bring together people, sector leaders from across, civil society, governments, within the private sector, and actually talk about how we catalyze this. What are the challenges? What is the barrier to action that's stopping us moving forward as a sector together? What are the platforms collaboration that we need? What are the dialogue and conversations that we need to be having together across companies, across CEOs, across CFOs, across COOs? How do we bring the investors into the room? How do we bring the car manufacturers, the technology companies? What are the demands they're making? How do we respond to that? What is it they need to see from us? So we start having this conversation that can actually begin to drive more effective and practical steps forward. That's something to look out for as well in February 2026.
What kinds of leadership behaviour, governance structures or cross-sector initiatives are starting to make a difference?
So I'd say that what we are seeing now is different kinds of role modeling by leaders, particularly at the CEO level, which I think is an important but fairly nascent development, where leaders are starting to talk more openly and even vulnerably about this issue. And I think that's a good start. Of course, focusing on the point about psychological safety, which I spoke about earlier on, alongside incentives and reporting systems, which I think can inform governance and drive more accountability. But what I would say beyond those specific things, if we look beyond the mining industry in South Africa, we're seeing a strong coalition building around gender-based violence, and it was catalyzed in many ways by government, championed by the president himself, And on the back of that, what we're seeing is the private sector more generally stepping in, and there's a gender-based violence fund that's been created in South Africa, and CEOs are personally pledging to champion this issue. And that's a good start. What happens thereafter and the quality of the programming in their organization is, I think, the thing to be paying attention to. What we've also seen, and Abby's alluded to this, is developments on the regulatory front. In the UK, in Australia, but also in South Africa, we've adopted this convention, this ILO convention C190, and it recognizes the importance of addressing sexual harassment at work. And then, of course, there's been legislation and guidelines, codes of good practice that seek to prevent and eliminate violence in the workplace. And one in particular, as I mentioned, that relates to to the mining sector, which I think could be relevant for other countries. Again, I think this is useful, but probably insufficient, So when we think about programming, Rob, and the kinds of leadership behavior, you asked about governance structures and even cross-sector initiatives. The biggest example, the most comprehensive approach that we've seen is what's happened at Rio Tinto, where there's good independent public reporting, which they've put out last year, the evidence from the independent review. And what we see when we look at that review is a mixed bag. I think it should be, Rio Tinto should be applauded for, again, making the review publicly available. I think it's a great example for the industry. But when we look at what they've been able to achieve of the 26 recommendations in the initial report, as at the report's launch late last year, 17 had been completed and 9 were still underway. But then when you dig into the numbers, within the last 12 months since the report's publication, 16% of women that were surveyed, and they surveyed over 10,000 people, 16% of women experienced sexual harassment in the last 12 months prior to the report being issued. That's 1 in 6 women in that specific environment that face sexual harassment just in those 12 months. And that number actually had not shifted at all since the prior initial report, despite all the effort that Rio Tinto had put into addressing GBV. And bullying isn't much better. 39% of people that were surveyed experienced bullying, and amongst younger people aged between 25 and 54, that number actually increased to 43%, So that's on the negative side. But on the positive side, at least half the workforce that was surveyed actually said that they think things are getting better on bullying and sexual harassment and on racism, and that they were quite optimistic about the next 2 years. And so they were seeing a positive trajectory, and often things do get worse before they get better. So, there's really a significant effort that went into this right from the top, from the ExCo and the board, lots of resources committed, and the results have been somewhat mixed. Some positive improvement, but also ongoing challenges. And so I think the big takeaway is that change will require sustained commitment. It's not linear, and it's going to come at a cost.
Yeah, I would just add to that. I mean, one of the things that I felt really strongly actually when I moved from sort of independent research, where you have a bit more flexibility to poke the bear from the outside, to working within a mining company. And I think one of the things that overwhelmed me most was actually there are brilliant people doing brilliant things in this sector. But we tend not to talk about it externally. There's a lot of really good work, really good conversations that are happening. But the minute you put the people on a platform or on a panel or, out there in the news, there's this kind of corporate speak that comes down. And actually, there is so much to learn by sharing what it is we're doing within, even within the industry itself, but actually even openly. I know Rio, probably people are like, well, that's an indication that that's not the route to go. Maybe, but maybe actually there is real strength in sharing the lessons and what it is that different companies are doing that works. I mean, the work that we did at Behaviours, to just give you a quick run through of that, was really amazing actually. And it started with, and I think I particularly call out the general managers here of Anglo American, but then of which, there were 20 general managers at Anglo American at the time, 7 of which were De Beers. They made a commitment to tackle gender-based violence. They were at a leaders conference in Peru, and they sat and listened to a presentation, and then they came together as general managers and said, we commit to tackling this. And from that, the 7 sort of De Beers general managers came to me and said, okay, what are we going to do about this? And luckily, Anglo American had a fantastic program in place. We had, the research and knowledge in place. But actually, the first thing that enabled us to do was bring all the general managers and their heads of corporate affairs, social performance, their head of communications, their head of HR together in person for 2 days just to talk about gender-based violence in Johannesburg. And that's a huge commitment of time. We had people flying in from Canada, as well as all the Southern African organizations. And that's when Mahmood and I first started working together. So it was really important, actually. And what I love about the Reos work is that holding space for those challenging conversations. Over those 2 days, we took, I use the word journey again, I know this, but on that journey from actually what's my personal experience of violence as a leader in this organization, but also, growing up at home, for example, how can I relate to this issue? But also, what are my hopes and fears around this work? And by sharing that, by kind of building that foundation of vulnerability and openness, we had general managers stand up, and these are very technical minded, very, effective, leaders saying, you know what, the big thing, I don't know what I'm doing here. I'm scared of getting it wrong. And that was the most powerful statement that anyone made across that 2 days is I'm scared of getting this wrong. But those 2 days really laid the foundation for the work that we did to go on. So then we set up a series of structures. And this is what I think, there's opportunity for the sector as a whole to replicate this, built around ongoing accountability, ongoing learning, and ongoing governance. And on the accountability, we had quarterly forums where those general managers came back together with their teams and they presented on what they'd done the last 3 months. So that kind of, it was a sense, okay, well, they've done that at, Venetia or in Namdeb, what can we do? How are we stacking up? What can we learn from that? We also did a series of quarterly masterclasses where we recognized this is a really complex topic, and these are mining guys. Yes, social performance teams, amazing on these issues. HR teams, fantastic, but actually, how do we get everyone understanding what GBV is and understanding some of those complexities around bystander intervention, around prevention versus response? What does an effective response system look like? So we had the masterclasses. And then we also had cross-functional teams. And so really, GBV is a very context-specific issue. So it's the site-level teams who rolled out these programs. It's them who have to decide what the priorities are, what their programs look like, how they adapt that to their context, both at the company and the community level. So those were cross-functional teams. So that involved your risk guys, your safety guys, your social performance, your HR, all working together to say, okay, how do we deal with this? And then we replicated that at group level where we had that that GBV working group where we bring together the same people and said, okay, what are the systemic changes that need to be made in risk, in safety, in HR, etc., and how do we roll that out? And there was more that we could have done at De Beers. We could have continued that program. There's growth still to be made, getting it onto the risk register, getting it onto the CEO's scorecard. There are still things that need to be done. But actually, there are real learnings there, and there are things that can be replicated. And it is about that kind of steady progress that wasn't taking a huge amount from everyone, but it was just keeping that steady building and momentum and making those progress and making those steps.
Just to add to what Abbi and Mahmood said, if we think about the importance of leadership and leadership traits that can play into this, social intelligence is so, so important in our next generation of leaders. And I think we acknowledged this in the article, but having people who are able to hold space for others, to listen, to sit with discomfort, and then help teams work through those outcomes in a really fair and progressive way, that is absolutely vital, because cultural change is going to come from the top. And we talk a lot in mining about digital transformation and the importance of that, but I think cultural transformation, that's actually going to be the next frontier in this sector, and that's going to come from leaders.
And finally, if each of you could leave one message or a call to action for mining leaders and professionals listening today, what would that be? And also, what's the next steps that moves this conversation from awareness to actual real change?
For me, the key takeaway is the need to keep momentum going here. With GBV, there is a huge amount of fear and shame that sits around this topic. But as a few people have said, and I think it's a Brene Brown quote probably, that shame can't survive being spoken. And although, there's a lot of pressure in this sector to get things right all the time, I think the most important thing is that we keep talking, we keep trying and learning and trying again. Over time, those small steps, those small progressions will add up to big change. So that for me is the biggest takeaway.
Yeah, from my side, the thing that always strikes me, as I do this work, and it's stayed with me over the years, is that in talking about gender-based violence, often it's quite easy to find people that are able to identify with the victim. We all have stories of people we know. Sometimes it's even individual, personal, painful stories of having been on the receiving end of some kind of abuse or victimization. And so that's something that I found you are able to get to fairly easily. And I think the challenge thing that we need to do more of or move towards in the sector is to figure out how we can start to identify with the perpetrator. And it's not just the perpetration of egregious forms of violence, but perpetration of disrespect, perpetration of microaggressions, and so not to view perpetrators as monsters, these people that do these bad things, because that lets the rest of us and the rest of society off the hook. And it prevents us, I think, from looking inward. And so I think trying to understand more broadly the cycle of trauma can really drive more accountability for everybody in the sector. Of course, perpetrators in particular, but also leaders more generally. And I think, building on your point, Carly, I think staying the course, investing, thinking about this in an integrated way and starting small, I think are key takeaways.
Yeah, my point would build on those 2 points. I think gender-based violence, besides being kind of one of those really jargony, horrible terms that some people don't really understand, but actually, if you put a label on a door or a workshop and say this is about gender-based violence or violence against women, you're going to have people walking into that room thinking, a woman walking in identifying, well, I'm the victim in this, and men walking in as I'm the perpetrator. And actually just that framing is hugely divisive and isn't actually the foundation for coming together. But also GBV, as you've heard today, is a highly complex issue, right? This is not something which we just, can simply deal with. And as many social issues within the sector are, and we know that. And I think perhaps, that's led to a level of avoidance, a level of paralysis, or even actually a knee-jerk reaction sometimes. So yes, we should have dealt with this issue 20 years ago in the mining sector, 30 years ago, 40 years ago. We'd like to all think that we could do that. And then sometimes you say, okay, well, now we're going to fix this. So the lesson I think I would to say is don't boil the ocean. You know, what we need to do actually is think about what we need to do now that we do in the right way. We're not going to fix this in 1 to 2 years. We're probably not even going to fix it in 5 to 10 years, sadly. But if we start doing the little actions or making the right changes in meaningful ways and considered ways and start making the right changes over time, that long-term sustained change, which Mahmood mentioned earlier, that is what we build. And that's really what's needed. So small steps, done well, don't get overwhelmed by the scale of the challenge, but just really start making a change and making a difference and have those conversations.
Thank you, Carly, Abbi and Mahmood, for giving your views on gender-based violence. Obviously, it's an important topic which you've obviously raised today, and a lot of issues associated with GBV in the workplace, and obviously especially in the mining industry. So really thank you for sharing your views, and obviously this message needs to get out further, which hopefully this platform will do with many listeners from all around the world within our industry. So if our audience obviously wants to ask further questions, I'll put all your details in the show notes so people can reach out to you if they've got any questions, and if they've got any questions or queries or any advice, hopefully you'll be able to answer them. So really thank you very much for sharing your views on this obviously important subject.
Thank you for having us, Rob.
Excellent. Thanks, Rob.
Great. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed that episode. As always, appreciate your continued support. Please keep sharing these episodes far and wide. This is obviously a very important subject, gender-based violence, and it needs to be shared amongst our industry. So thank you for listening, and please keep sharing these episodes amongst people within the workplace, your friends, your colleagues, and even probably people outside of the mining industry, as this important topic needs to be shared. So thank you again, and until next time, happy mining.
Thank you for listening. Remember to reach out to Rob via the show notes, and be sure to subscribe and leave a review. Until next time, happy mining, helping each other to improve the mining industry.